Hi, it's Brian McDonough, and welcome to the Dr. Brian McDonough Show. I have a very special guest today, Mike Jensen. If you're from the Philadelphia area, you know of Mike Jensen's work because he has been a sports writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer for a 35-year career, an extensive career, and certainly he covered all sorts of sports, but in particular, college basketball is what we're going to talk about today. He has a book coming out called Philly Hoops, The City That Shaped the Game. And first of all, Mike, thanks for joining me on the program.
Oh, thanks for having me, Brian.
You know, I of course read so many articles that you've written over the years, and growing up in kind of a basketball family and being the non-basketball player, I was always a fan, and especially the '60s and '70s Big Five basketball. I mean, I grew up like watching games on black and white UHF television, fading in and fading out as they were showing games, and just started to really enjoy. And for those around the country, the Big Five in Philadelphia, Villanova, St. Joe's, LaSalle, Penn, and Temple. And of course, there's now a sixth team, which is certainly doing quite well too, which is Drexel. It's the Philly Six, more or less. But that's kind of the background of a very unique basketball history. And enough of me, more of Mike. Tell me a little bit about when you first, was it just covering the game? Were you a fan of the game to begin with? How did you get involved with Philly basketball?
Well, it was literally coming to Philadelphia for the job. So I grew up around New York, and Philadelphia meant a number of things. Meant Wilt and meant the Sixers, but I didn't grow up on Palestra doubleheaders. I didn't grow up on the Palestra until the first game I was in the Palestra I covered for the Inquirer. I came and my first job was Delaware County high schools, and even high schools in Delaware County, just a tremendous rich heritage. Now we're talking, I got there in 1988. We're talking former Big Five Hall of Famers coaching in the Catholic League and the public league schools. In the leagues were the Del Val and the Central and in Delaware County, former college coaches. I learned a ton the few years I was covering basketball in the suburbs, and then you'd fill in covering some of the teams. And then I got on the Penn beat right when the Maloney Allen years, Fran Dunphy coaching. So I I covered 3 years of Penn basketball, and they never lost a game in the Ivy League those 3 years. It was crazy. And watching those practices was a great education for me. Then I covered Villanova for a couple of years. Those were the last 2 years of Alvin Williams and Jason Lawson. So it was 1 year of Kerry Kittles and 1 year of Tim Thomas. Great teams, great regular seasons. First round was fine in the NCAA tournament. Couldn't win that second round game and get to the Sweet 16 those years. And then I covered John Chaney for 9 years. So that was before I started writing columns about college basketball across the landscape. So I didn't grow up on what you grew up on. I didn't grow up on, and I understand that from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, it was a big wheel and everyone had a turn on top in the Big Five. That was the era where in those 3 decades, every one of the Big Five schools went to the Final Four, each of them separately. An amazing deal in that regard. From the mid 50s of Paul Arizin at Villanova and Tom Gola at LaSalle winning a national championship. Paul Arizin was National Player of the Year, and then Temple getting to 2 Final Fours in 3 years. So, and then these late 60s, early 70s, which was, some say, was the heyday of Big Five basketball with LaSalle, Villanova, Penn, really dominant programs, and then Temple winning the NIT in 1969. So I'm babbling away here because I could go on forever, obviously, on the history of it.
Right. So when you look at those days and want to go back to it, that was great basketball. You came in, like you said, at a wonderful time, coming in with a legendary coach in Fran Dunphy. Let's talk about him for a second. What was Fran Dunphy like as a coach? He clearly, maybe he has an attachment to almost every school in the Big Five.
Yeah, at Penn, he had just taken over as Penn coach a couple of years before then. And so he was young and at his most intense, great talent, Literally, I think the best practice coach I ever saw in terms of not just organized, but the attention to detail, where just nothing was going to get past him. I mean, he had a staff where, Fran O'Hanlon was given great responsibility to run the offense. Steve Donahue, Gil Jackson were assistant coaches. It was a very good time. It might have not been the top time of Penn basketball. That was back when those Penn teams were playing Howard Porter and those Villanova teams. But this was pretty special basketball, and it was great for a fairly young journalist to really see what was going on. And it was a different era of journalism where I went on the road for every single game they played, home and road for 3 years. So, and including the Ivy League. So I was at every game at Dartmouth that, they were home and road Friday and Saturday nights in the Ivy League. So you were traveling in between, obviously, but great experience for a young writer.
Yeah, an interview like this obviously grabs people who are big basketball fans. So I know people are probably, thinking about, but if you think about Penn and Villanova, my memories was 1 year, I think it was the same year, Penn beat Villanova during the regular season in like a 33-32, really close game. And then Villanova came back and beat them in the tournament. I think it was 90-47.
It was 90-47.
Yeah, I know. I remember that, but it was a great game. But also Penn later on went to the Final Four, and back when they used to play a semifinal game, they lost. But I think in the semis they even lost to they lost to Magic Johnson's team, Michigan.
You got it right.
Yeah, so I mean they were up there in the Final Four as late as like 79. They had a pretty darn good history between the early 70s, 79, and Dunphy and winning. Villanova obviously has gotten a great deal of attention. You mentioned the Villanova years. I'm gathering that was Steve Lapis years when you
correct
him. And I'm thinking, knowing the games, I think there was a year they lost to Old Dominion when they were like seeded third, and they lost to Old Dominion in the tournament in the second round. Was that one of the years you were covering them?
That was the year before I covered it. That was the killer game. I was still covering Penn at that point. They lost to what, double or triple overtime.
Yeah.
And if they picked up that game, I think the whole history of the program in the 90s would have been different, because then there wouldn't have been so much pressure to get to the second weekend. They were such a talented team. When that would have been Kerry Kittle's junior year. So that the 2 years that I covered them, if you remember, they lost to Louisville and they lost to Cal. And I can't remember maybe I have the order wrong, but those were the two opponents they lost to in the second round, and they were the better seed in both. So that was tough going. And at that point, Villanova's a program where you need to get to that second weekend so the recruits of that level keep coming. Yeah, I covered him for 9 years. I think he never used the word off the record either. I mean, you had just full access to that brain. And maybe like literally once in 9 years, he said between you and me on something. I can remember what that something was. And then one time I literally asked him, he was blistering another coach for negative recruiting because the guy was stupid enough to put it on paper, his negative thoughts, not just on Chaney, but on Bill Self and other coaches. And that paper got to Chaney. So he called myself and Mike Kern into his office, and he's just crushing this guy. And I'm like, is this on the record? And he goes, what do you bleep think I got you in here for? Of course it was on the record. And I was, so it was a good story for the next day's paper. And I was on Tony Kornheiser's national radio show the next day explaining what John thought about it, and he was trying to get me to sort of, I don't know, he wanted me to turn around and almost blast Chaney for Chaney blasting this coach, Andy Kennedy, who was a Cincinnati assistant at the time under Bob Huggins. And I was like, I'm not blasting a guy for A, he's not wrong, and B, he's going to speak his piece. So it was definitely wild. This book I'm writing will have a whole lot of John Chaney in it. It'll have 4 or 5 chapters of John Chaney, because John Chaney is such a Philadelphia figure.
So now we're talking a little bit, we now passed Chaney, then you're writing columns as well. You then have, I guess, basically a palette. You can paint whatever you want, right? At that point in your career, you're picking and choosing.
Yeah, I could anything that interested me, small colleges, get up to Penn State football a little bit, across the women's basketball uh, landscape, and around that time, obviously Villanova was rising again, and when I I was never the beat writer on the championship teams, I was the basketball columnist. I was the extra. So we sort of realized that we needed to give more coverage than just having a beat writer and an occasional general columnist there. So one of my bosses, I can remember the deputy sports editor at the time, I believe, in Gary Petoskey, say, "Let's have you at every home game," and I would write a column that would be on our website. Things had moved to that stage of journalism digitally, so that I'd write something and it would be up in either 8 o'clock the next morning or 10 o'clock the next morning, but I would have time to write it. It wouldn't have to be in for that paper. It would be in for the next day's paper. And so you got a lot more Villanova coverage from the Inquirer after they won. And I can remember Jay Wright saying to me, "You're around more." And I goes, "Well, you won a national championship." And he was like, "I was hoping that was the reason." They have their own analytics and they care about that stuff. I mean, it was rah rah for the Big Five, but they want the most coverage, obviously.
It's interesting. And by the way, I'm speaking with writer Mike Jensen. He has a book coming out, Philly Hoops, the city that shaped the game. And, in this book that you're writing, obviously, you bring it up all the way up to Jay Wright, who is Hall of Fame coach now. Last I saw him, he was on national television as an analyst during March Madness. So he's doing quite well for himself. I want to ask you one thing about present basketball, and I'll use Jay Wright as the example. I was stunned when he left. He had already just made it to the Final Four. He had won in 16, won in 18, made it to the Final Four, and then he retires from the game. But now that I've seen what's happened with name, image, and likeness, I'm wondering, was he looking at the future and saying, "This isn't for me"?
To some extent, I believe absolutely. I mean, for one thing, he had done the things that one could do in the sport, and he wasn't 45. I mean, he was hitting, into his 60s himself. So he was looking around. But the way he put it to me, I don't remember if it was a year later or one way he put it was like, I was used to having all the answers. And here I really didn't. And sometimes even when his staff was bringing things up, he was like, hadn't thought of that, hadn't thought of that. He'd been very busy as an Olympic assistant coach. If you remember, the 2020 Olympics were postponed for a year. So he ended up, it almost was a 2-year process and being away a lot. So I think he was genuinely tired on all that front. But I think he could see the future. Coach like Jay, like Tony Bennett at UVA, who left, you're seeing a lot of that generation saying, had a good run. This is different. Let's have somebody else do it.
Now, I know your book is going to be focusing on a lot of the history of Philly basketball, but I do want to ask you going forward, are you optimistic? I mean, it seems like there's so many changes in the game that, it's a world of difference from probably when you started covering it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a many-pronged deal right there, right, Brian? I mean, locally, now you have to have money to pay players to compete. So the era of John Chaney just being sort of running a program out of his back pocket in a basement office with no windows and not having cash, not wanting to have any cash, that's gone. That's over. I don't think John Chaney could have competed in this era, nor would he have wanted to. And all the way around. So Villanova has money to compete. They have money to compete nationally. They're still in the game. St. Joe's, I think they saw their boosters, their big boosters saw what Villanova was doing, and they can compete within the Atlantic 10. I think the key is, can you compete within your league? I mean, the NCAA, in the NCAA fashion, when this name, image, and likeness came along, they had a rule where you can't use this to recruit or retain athletes. Well, what do you think it's for? I mean, it's like, if you're going to do this, you're going to do this. And I think now they realize, I wouldn't be surprised if sometime this summer it comes out that they're working on negotiating on having contracts, because it's two prongs. And many people, myself included, think players should be paid if there is revenue that's coming in. That's the way it works in the rest of sports, college sports being an exception. So that makes sense. But also with the transfer portal, instant eligibility means you can play for 4 years, four schools, 4 years, just constantly move around. And they're all doing it because you can get a better deal. I think if they have a contract where, okay, let's say you sign a 3-year contract, and if the coach leaves, you can break the contract. But otherwise, you would have to return the money and become instantly ineligible at a new school if you don't, something like that, to move along, more like professional contracts. That's the thing. The NBA couldn't operate if every contract was a 1-year contract. It just wouldn't work. The NFL, it wouldn't work.
That makes a lot of sense what you're saying, because even in, as a physician, where you if you work for a hospital organization, they sign you for a period of time, but then there's all these rules if you were to leave, how many miles you can have a practice, those things. You agree to it up front, and you say, okay, I can do whatever I want, but if I'm going to sign this contract now, I'm limiting the college players. Then they would decide to do that, and that would separate them from, let's say, a tuba player who might go from school to school because they're not signing a contract. They're just
that's right, just transferring as a student.
Now let's get to the book, the exciting part. What are you focusing on? I mean, obviously you mentioned you have chapters on Cheney and all those years. Where do you pick it up, and how far do you take it?
Well, I pick it up right at the beginning of the 20th century with the earliest days of Philadelphia basketball, at Roman Catholic High School and the Philadelphia Spas and camps up in the Poconos, and things that have been written a bunch. I tried to move into new territories. I'm not trying to write an encyclopedia. I'm trying to tell tales. But then what I really wanted to focus on was why Philadelphia was so important. Well, Paul Arizin didn't take the first jump shot in basketball, but Paul Arizin, who was from South Philadelphia, went to LaSalle High School, was cut every year at LaSalle High School, ended up playing in church leagues against stevedores down by the docks. And they were beating him up, and including his teammates, like if he'd missed shots. And he was slipping all over the place on these floors at St. Monica's and these other gyms. And he finally decided, what if I jump? And so he did. And there had been other jump shots around the country in college basketball, but they were funky looking shots. He had a shot that you would recognize. And Villanova, he played in a summer tournament. He had gone to Villanova for a year, didn't play basketball, but he was getting better because of these church leagues. And he was in this summer tournament, and he ended up, at the time, the summer tournament, the gold medal tournament, Villanova could put their team in, and Temple could put their team in. And Arizin and his guys, they beat them both. And Temple's coach came over and said, hey, you want to go to Temple? And Al Severance was the coach at Villanova. The story that Arizin told his sons was that Severance came over and said, you want to go to Villanova? And he said, I already go to Villanova. And that's literally how 2.5 years later, he was the National Player of the Year, easiest recruiting job of Al Severance's career. So that jump shot coming from Philadelphia, Earl Monroe, in the words of his great teammate Clyde Frazier at the New York Knicks, Earl Monroe took the playground to the NBA. Not that everyone played on playgrounds before, but playground moves that, really changed the game in the NBA. That can be traced back to Earl Monroe. So I have a long chapter on Earl Monroe. I have a chapter on the dominance of Wilt, obviously. I have the worldwide popularity of Kobe, the importance of Jack Ramsey. And then what really puts it over the top, as far as why Philadelphia is important, so important, like number one on the list of importance. Like Brooklyn could argue, we're just as good. Sure, not in women's basketball. When you start, the first women's national tournament was at Westchester University, started by the Westchester coach, with big time schools coming in to play at Westchester, and Westchester won. Then the great Immaculata story was built on local players, because Philadelphia was already such a high school hotbed that Immaculata in the 70s became a powerhouse, became, a storybook Cinderella story, this little Catholic college in Chester County winning national championships. And then Cheney University, 10 miles away from Immaculata, getting to 2 Final Fours in the first 3 years that the NCAA had the tournament. Again, with local players, already in place. Basketball was already important, women's basketball. So then you get to Gino Auriemma starting his dynasty, and how it started. His career started in Philly, and sort of the crazy stories there, with Phil Martelli, with Jim Foster, and then of course Dawn Staley, the importance of Dawn. So there's so much important women's basketball history that it's, I'm jumping around a lot. There's so much to get in, and that's before getting to Cheney and getting to Jay Wright and some others.
I would think you must have incredible stories too, because you're there on the front lines talking to people.
The through line for me is impact on the game. So it's more a players and coaches than sort of the Big Five fan experience, which has been written about in great detail.
So when you talk about like an Earl Monroe, I mean, my memory of him was more professional basketball, like when he was with, originally it was with the Baltimore Bullets at the time, but he had this spin move. Like he just could spin by people. It was like wild. Like, and you did notice him, even as a little boy watching a game, he seemed so much faster than everybody else. But you're saying a lot of it was what he learned in Philly playing basically on the streets.
Oh, he took me through that spin move, because I was the same way. I'm 62 years old. I had the world's clunkiest spin move, in a driveway move, but everyone would try to do it. And Earl took me through who he picked it up from, what were the nuances of it, and how he sort of tripped, and that caused him to keep the ball in the same hand, which made for a better spin move. And he kept that for the rest of his life. I don't even know if he told that story until he was 80 years old, where he was like, I'll tell the truth now. So it was great talking to him, but I had, I take you inside a camp. I take you inside the Baker League games where he was Black Jesus. I mean, he was the guy in the Baker League in Philadelphia in the summertime. So you're right. His was more professional. He didn't come up. This isn't so much a Big Five history, because he was neglected by the Big Five. Guys like John Cheney and Earl Monroe and Ray Scott and T. Parham were Philadelphia basketball, and it wasn't there yet for their era.
What do you think, when you look at it, who do you think were the best players to come out of this city? I mean, we didn't even talk about like Gene Banks and other people, but who do you think were the best players? Would it be Wilt? Would he be the best of the best?
Yeah, I mean, if I'll make the point in the book that if you can have your own argument for Jordan or LeBron, whoever, Kareem for best player, but if you're talking about most dominant player in the history of basketball, and you mention anybody but Wilt, you sound naive. So you start with Wilt. Of course, you start with Wilt, and then you get to Paul Arizin. You're basically to make on that list, you have to be a Hall of Famer, because you're talking about the Hall of Fame includes Paul Arizin, Earl Monroe, Guy Rogers, Tom Gola. Again, Tom Gola won a national championship, and then came in second the next year, had been a National Player of the Year by one organization as a junior, by another organization as a senior. Bill Russell got him senior year. So times were changing, but then his obituary has a line where he was the all-time NCAA rebounding leader, still is, by the way. And then as a rookie, he was the point guard on an NBA championship Warriors team. I mean, those facts don't exist in even, that's a Magic Johnson-like deal. But even Magic Johnson do that first part. So that's sort of Philly. And then Kobe, you can have the argument, is Kobe from Philly? Well, yeah, there's all sorts of Philly that is completely Kobe. And I was lucky enough to cover the Beijing Olympics for the Inquirer in 2008, and basketball was part of my sort of portfolio. So I was there a lot. And Kobe was the most popular athlete at the Beijing Olympics, and I take people through that a little bit, including what Kobe had to say at the time.
Wow, this is gonna be a great book. It must be fun for you to like to kind of not to cap off your career, probably do a lot of stuff, but that must be really good to put it all in one book. It also has to be, I imagine, you're probably what you'd leave out of the book could be as exciting as what's in the book because there's so much.
Yeah, I mean, it's a labor of love. It's my life's work for sure.
Mike Jensen, I want to thank you for taking the time. It took a lot of your time, and I really appreciate talking basketball. And I know people watching this are going to enjoy it quite a bit as well. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Brian. Listen to you forever.
I know it's getting up there too. Thanks a lot. Talk to you later.
Thank you.